All right. So finally, let's talk a little bit about Karl Marx here. The piece I had you read is from the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844, so a fairly early writing for Marx. And in a certain sense, a lot of what you can see here gets developed and changed over Marx's later writings. This is often seen as one of his most philosophical writings, and it's here that he has a section which I guess is somewhat controversial, and it's the section we're actually reading right now, and it's on the notion of alienation or estrangement. So what Marx is doing here is he's trying to show that our very nature itself is conditioned by the kind of society, the forces in society in which we find ourselves. And so, it very much kind of an opposite move to what you would have had with classical liberalism, of course, where you start with the individual, and the individual's choices, therefore, will create the structures of society. For Marx, it's the other way around. It's, there's a very strong sense that the structures of society, in particular our modes of production and consumption, and all the institutions that develop around those, are the things that create our ourselves, our sense of self, our very natures, and along with that, our senses of ethics and so forth. And so, for Marx, this really represents another kind of possibility, I suppose, of the relationship between ethics, epistemology, and social theory, and it really puts social theory or social philosophy at the forefront, right? And so for Marx, I mean, I'm sure you've all studied Marx at some point or another, so I'm not going to go over all of the details, but if you think about it for a second, Marx is telling us, under the conditions of feudalism, let's say, there is a certain way that we produce things and a certain way we consume things. There are certain relationships, therefore, between those who have the means of production and those who don't. And it's a fundamentally different kind of thing than what we find under capitalism. Marx is, believe it or not, a fan of capitalism. He absolutely believes in it because it's a necessary part on the road towards full human development. He never wants to get rid of capitalism in history. He simply thinks that it's going to be outmoded. It's going to be overcome as we come to realize its limits. Okay, so he writes a whole lot about it because of that. I mean, it's not, he wants to start from, as he often puts it, and he puts it in our reading here. He wants to start from actual economic facts, and he thinks he's being a social scientist. He's thinking he's observing the world in this. He's not doing what Hobbes did and imagining a state of nature that we've never seen. He's not, furthermore, being Adam Smith or David Ricardo or any of these economists that precede him, even though he respects them, he is not starting from some kind of notion that there is a fundamental nature to the individual, and then we have to examine what happens after that. For him, individuality is a feature of capitalism, right? It's not a feature of other kinds of systems. And along with that, things like acquisitiveness, the need to acquire, the need to be competitive, the need to think of ourselves first. I mean, all of these kinds of things are functions of a particular social setting in which we find ourselves, all right? So what you saw with someone like Mill was the notion that it all starts with us, and then we have no control over anything except ourselves. Our wishes and our actions go out there in the world, and then the world is created through the all the actions acting together. For Marx, there is a sense that that's a little too simple, because that simply takes for granted the notion of the individual as primary. And he wants to say, look, we can fundamentally misunderstand ourselves, and we often do, right? This whole section on alienation, I think, is a great example of that. I mean, he is trying to tell us here that there are a number of ways that we are alienated from each other and from the world. We're alienated from the product of our labor. We make things under capitalism, but we're not making what we want to make. We're making what somebody else wants us to make. And so what's happening is that that thing is being taken away from us. and we are making it along somebody else's specifications. We're not engaging in any kind of creative act. There's nothing creative about that kind of production because we are not really learning anything. We're not really refining anything. We're not really advancing ourselves in any way. We're simply producing something on somebody else's behest. And so, it's an action which is not really part of our own life, Marx argues. And because of that, we find ourselves alienated from our species. I mean, we are under the illusion that we are individuals struggling against other individuals, Marx says, when in fact we should realize that this entire way of producing is, gives us that illusion. We think we are individuals against each other when in fact we are all subject to a system which requires of us that we make things that are not truly ours, that do not truly add to our own creativity and production. And because of all of that, nature itself becomes alienated from us. And you can find versions of environmentalism in the 20th century, Murray Bookchin, for example, who argue that all of the environmental problems that we have are traceable back to problems, the issues that we have in our social world. So a very Marxian sort of approach to all of this. Now, of course, contemporary capitalist theory has responses to these sorts of things. I'm not presenting these things to argue for them. What I'm presenting them to you for is to get you to think about another possible way that social theory, knowledge, and ethics might relate to each other. This is the way in which social theory comes first, all right? And we see lots of kinds of variations on this, and many of them take the form of, this almost harkens back to Augustine in a certain sense, takes the form of us not truly understanding who we are, right? I mean, that's what Augustine said too, if you recall. And so we had to get to know who we are. And of course, we see variations on that with Marx. We see variations on that with Feuerbach before Marx. We see variations on that with Freud, right? Now, in that sense, at least, I'm not saying that Freud and Augustine or Marx and Augustine are in any, similar in all respects. They certainly are not. But they are similar in the sense that there is a need for us to get to know ourselves past how we mistakenly, take ourselves. In other words, you could put all of those figures on one side of the ledger and then someone like Mill on the other side of the ledger who thinks, we know ourselves. That's a very kind of Cartesian sort of notion, in fact. We know ourselves first and best. And, for Augustine and for Marx and these others, we have to get to know ourselves. And how do we get to know ourselves? We get to know ourselves through action in society and through getting rid of our illusions about ourselves and, things of that nature. So, if that's true, I mean, think about how this might work with ethics then, because, for someone like Augustine, it's pretty straightforward. It's basically a kind of Platonic ethics. What we need to do is get rid of our illusions, and then we will understand what true value means, and then we can act ethically. You get something different with Marx, right? Because for Marx, it's going to be, acting ethically means to get to know yourself, to get rid of your illusions, yes, but you will only be able to be so ethical under a particular, transitional system such as capitalism. The way to be truly ethical will be to overturn capitalism. Will be to move past that mode of production into a mode where we can see that value is not just about what is good for me or good for you, but what is good for all of us together. And so for Marx, there's always that move where, even true individualism starts making sense once we have a sense of value that extends past our own interests, basically. So, that's important, very important difference, right? And certainly it's a very important difference in the United States today. You can, this is one of the kind of classic critiques that people have of the American social world. Certainly from more traditional societies. When I've been in Africa, I often hear this, Americans are so individualistic, they only think about what's good for themselves and maybe the immediate people around them, and that's really no way to live ethically. That's not, there's no sense of altruism in that. There's no sense of community feeling. And so when I'm in Africa, people say, look, what kind of an ethic is that? I mean, that's just serving yourself. That's not an ethic at all. That's hardly something to base a code of conduct on. What we really need is a code of conduct that recognizes, the value of everyone, the good of everyone, even possibly self-sacrifice in the service of others, things of that nature. So there are those kinds of arguments we might have, and Marx, I think, would want to point us towards a version of the good, a version of ethics that transcends us. So in that sense, at least, I mean, as negative as Marx might be against religion, calling it the opiate of the masses and all of that sort of thing, he does have a similar kind of goal, in the sense that both for a religious version of ethics, as we saw with Augustine, and for Marx, there is a sense that it has to go beyond yourself, right? It's not just about your own interests. For that reason, I think you see with, certainly a number of social justice movements in Latin America and in Africa and other places, you see actually a very close connection between certain versions of religion and certain versions of socialism. There is a sense that these are not incompatible bedfellows, because there is an ethic of the common good, an ethic of the other, an ethic of sharing, an ethic of all of these sorts of things. So Marx offers us an approach that we didn't see really in Comte or in Mill, but which has echoes of certain kinds of ethics that came before. My own personal sense is that Marx in part gets this because of his inheritance from Hegel, and more importantly, because of the Lutheran inheritance that all of them share. I mean, Marx, while being Jewish, is certainly brought up within a Lutheran Germany, just as Hegel was. And for Lutherans, the debt to Augustine is profound. It's huge. And so what we have then is an echo, I think, of an ethic that needs to take into account something other than one's own interests. So, we've got a few more options on putting these things together. And what I'd like to ask you to do, you remember last week I mentioned to you that there's a collaborative document within the Canvas structure here, in which I would like all of us to try and put in some of the questions that occur when we think about these areas, at the edges of these areas with each other. And also I'd like us to list the various ways that we could think about the relationship between these areas. So what happens when you start with epistemology? What happens when you start with ethics? What happens when you start with social philosophy? What happens when you start with the individual or the group? What happens when you start with a metaphysical notion or a religious notion? What happens, all of these things yield different kinds of implications about how we ought to act in the world. And so I'd like to set all of these things up as we go, and then once we get to looking at our major books in the course, Lorraine Code and Philip Kitcher, I think we're going to be able to evaluate what's going on there in a much clearer manner. So that's the plan, and have at it in the discussion about all of this, and let's work on that document together. All right. Thanks.